The oppressive scent of money hung in the air at Aurelia, a 3-Michelin-star temple of gastronomy where the wealthy came to worship at the altar of their own success. For Clara Evans, the scent was a constant, suffocating reminder of the gulf between her world and theirs. It smelled like the overdue notices for her father's physical therapy, the second mortgage on their small house in Queens, and the art history degree she'd been forced to abandon. She moved through the dining room with the practiced invisibility of a ghost, balancing plates of seared foie gras that cost more than her weekly grocery budget. At 22, she was a master of the silent performance required of her. Be pleasant, be efficient, be nothing. It was a role she played to perfection, especially for the occupants of Table 12, the restaurant's most coveted corner booth, Julian Croft and his fiancée, Isabella Montgomery. Julian Croft was not tech royalty or a Wall Street wolf. He was something older, more formidable. He was the sole heir to Croft Global Logistics, a century-old shipping empire built on steel, salt water, and ruthless negotiation. He had inherited a dynasty and, through sheer, obsessive intellect, had dragged it into the 21st century. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, missed nothing. They were the eyes of a man who calculated risk in his sleep, who saw the world as a complex chessboard where he was always 10 moves ahead. He wasn't overtly cruel, but he was perpetually insulated by a layer of data and distraction, his thumb a constant blur across the screen of his phone. He saw Clara, but only as a function, a minor variable in the equation of his dinner. Isabella Montgomery was the equation's perfect, beautiful answer. She was the product of generations of inherited wealth, a woman sculpted from marble and disdain. Her blonde hair was the color of chilled champagne, her voice a silken whisper that could flay a person's confidence in a single sentence. To Julian, she was a doting, supportive partner, the ideal society wife to solidify his family's legacy. To the staff, she was a quiet tyrant. "This water," Isabella said one evening, nudging the crystal glass a fraction of an inch with a perfectly manicured finger. "It has condensation on the outside. I require a fresh glass, on a coaster, wiped dry before it is placed on the table. And the ice should be a single, clear sphere. Is that understood?" "Of course, Miss Montgomery." "My apologies," Clara murmured, her professional smile feeling like a hardening mask. "See that it is." Isabella dismissed her without a glance, turning her radiant smile back to Julian. "Darling, Adrian was telling me the final papers for the Vanguard merger are ready. He's been an absolute godsend." Clara retreated, her hand steady despite the tremor of humiliation in her chest. It was the casual cruelty, the assumption of her incompetence, that stung the most. Julian, as usual, just gave a distracted nod, his eyes fixed on a shipping route projection on his phone. "Good. Adrian is the best. Tell him to execute." Adrian Thorne. The third point of their gilded triangle. He was Julian's chief operating officer, his best friend since their days at Yale. The man he trusted more than anyone. He was handsome, charming, and always present, the loyal brother Julian never had. Clara had often seen him at their table, a seamless part of their perfect picture. She often wondered what Julian, a man who commanded a global fleet, saw in a woman whose primary skill was orchestrating social events. They were the city's power couple, their engagement the subject of endless fawning articles. But from Clara's vantage point, the power looked like a performance, and the love looked like a transaction. She returned with the water, prepared to Isabella's impossibly precise specifications. Isabella examined it, took a delicate sip, and gave a slight nod of approval, a queen granting a pardon to a serf. Clara vanished back into the shadows. Her job done. She glanced back at the table. Julian had finally put his phone down and was looking at Isabella, a genuine, if weary, affection in his eyes. He was in love with the idea of her, the idea of a stable, predictable, blue-blooded dynasty. Clara sighed, collecting a tray of empty wine glasses. It wasn't her business. Her job was to serve the fantasy, not to see the cracks in its foundation. The revelation came on a miserably wet Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that washed the glamour from New York, leaving only grit. The lunch service was quiet, the restaurant a hushed cavern of muted conversations. At 1:30, the hostess seated a couple at table 9, a secluded alcove in Clara's section. She smoothed her apron, fixed her smile in place, and approached. "Welcome to Aurelia. May I get you started with—" Her voice died in her throat. It was Isabella Montgomery, but the man across from her was not Julian Croft. It was Adrian Thorne. "A bottle of the Krug Clodambonnet," Isabella said, her voice low and intimate, not even looking up at Clara. "And 2 glasses. Don't dawdle." "Of course," Clara whispered, backing away, her mind a frantic scramble. A business lunch, she told herself. Of course. Adrian was the COO, but the atmosphere was all wrong. It wasn't the charged energy of a business deal. It was the soft, conspiratorial intimacy of lovers. Their knees were pressed together under the table. Isabella, usually so poised and glacial, was laughing, a throaty, uninhibited sound Clara had never heard before. She reached across the table and laid her hand on Adrian's. He immediately turned his own over, lacing his fingers through hers. A cold knot formed in Clara's stomach. She retrieved the champagne, her movements robotic. As she poured the pale gold liquid, she kept her eyes fixed on the task, avoiding the couple's faces. "That will be all, Charlotte," Isabella said, waving her away, mangling her name as she always did. "It's Clara," she said softly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Isabella's cold blue eyes finally lifted, meeting hers for the first time. The gaze was sharp, dismissive. "I don't recall asking." Clara retreated, her cheeks burning. She took refuge behind a large marble pillar, ostensibly polishing already gleaming silverware. From there, she had a perfect, reflected view of their table, in a large, gilt-edged mirror on the opposite wall. She watched as Adrian leaned in, murmuring something that made Isabella's eyes glitter. Then, right there, in the hushed elegance of Aurelia, he leaned across the table and kissed her. It wasn't a peck on the cheek. It was a deep, lingering kiss filled with a desperate, pent-up passion that felt like a violation to witness. Clara felt a wave of nausea. This was a full-blown affair, a betrayal of the deepest kind, happening with the one man Julian Croft trusted unconditionally. She was about to turn away, to force herself to forget what she'd seen, when she heard a snippet of their conversation drift towards her. "The final signature on the Vanguard addendum," Adrian was saying, his voice a low thrum. "He trusts me to sign on his behalf when he's overseas. He won't even look at it." "And you're certain?" Isabella asked, tracing the rim of her glass. "His personal signature is so distinct. Isabella, darling, I've been studying it for a year. It's perfect. More perfect than his own, probably. Once that's filed, the restructuring clause is triggered. After the wedding, control of the holding company defaults to me as the primary signatory officer. He'll be a figurehead. He's so obsessed with building his legacy, he's forgotten to protect it from the man holding the blueprints." Clara's blood ran cold. This wasn't just cheating. This was a coup. They weren't just breaking his heart. They were planning to steal his entire empire from under him. The detail about the signature snagged in her brain. His personal signature is so distinct. Clara's abandoned art history degree had focused on Renaissance portraiture, and, more specifically, the analysis of master artists' signatures and brushwork, the tiny, unconscious flourishes that made a signature authentic, the subtle tells of a forgery. She had a near photographic memory for such details. She remembered seeing a photo in Forbes of Julian Croft signing a major contract. His signature, a bold, angular slash with a peculiar, almost imperceptible break in the final stroke of the T. A forger might get the shape right, but the pressure, the speed of that final stroke, almost impossible to replicate. She spent the rest of her shift in a fog of cold dread. What could she possibly do? This wasn't just gossip. It was a conspiracy to commit massive corporate fraud. If she said something, Isabella and Adrian would deny it. Julian would believe them. She would be fired, blacklisted, and branded a liar. Her father's care, her family's home, all gone. If she said nothing, she would be serving champagne to predators while they orchestrated the ruin of a man who, for all his detachment, had never been anything but professionally courteous to her. She clocked out at midnight, her mind a battlefield. She walked home through the rain, the weight of the secret pressing down on her. She had made her decision. She would say nothing. It wasn't her world, it wasn't her fight. She was just the waitress. 3 nights later, the restaurant was thundering with the sound of success. Clara was deep in the weeds, a blur of motion between 4 demanding tables. At 8 o'clock, Julian and Isabella were seated at table 12. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Seeing them together, knowing the venomous secret that coiled between them, made her feel physically ill. Julian seemed unusually tense, a deep line etched between his brows. Isabella, sensing his mood, was working overtime, her laughter a little too loud, her touches a little too frequent. Her demands of Clara were, consequently, sharper than ever. "This risotto is lukewarm," she snapped, pushing the plate away after a single bite. "Is the kitchen staff incompetent, or are you just slow? Take it back." "My sincerest apologies, Miss Montgomery. I will have them prepare a fresh one immediately." "Don't bother," Isabella sighed dramatically. "You've already ruined the timing of the meal. Just bring me a club soda. And this time, try not to bruise the bubbles." Clara collected the plate, her face a burning mask of composure. As she turned away, she heard Julian's low voice. "Isabella, for God's sake, it was rice. Stop being cruel." "I'm not being cruel, darling." Isabella's voice turned sharp as ice. "I'm demanding excellence. It's what we pay for. It's a principle you, of all people, should appreciate. You don't build an empire by accepting mediocrity. If someone can't do their job, they should be replaced." The hypocrisy was so profound, it made Clara dizzy. This woman was lecturing Julian on loyalty while actively plotting to gut his life's work. She returned to the table later to clear their main courses. Isabella had gone to the powder room, leaving Julian alone. He was rubbing the bridge of his nose, the massive sapphire on his signet ring catching the light. He looked utterly exhausted, a king besieged in his own castle, unaware that the traitors were already inside the gates. Clara began to clear the plates. This was the moment. Say nothing. Walk away. Lose your job. Lose everything. But the image of her father, struggling through his therapy with quiet dignity, flashed in her mind. He had taught her that integrity was the one thing a person owned that no one could take away, unless you gave it away. She took a deep, shuddering breath. "Mr. Croft." He looked up, his stormy grey eyes focusing on her for what felt like the first time. "Yes." "I know this is not my place," she began, her voice barely a whisper. and I understand that you have no reason to believe me. You can fire me for this, and I understand. But I have to tell you something." He frowned, his full, unnerving attention now fixed on her. "What is it?" "Your fiancée, Miss Montgomery," Clara said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. "She is being unfaithful to you." The air around their table seemed to crystallize. Julian's expression didn't shift. It simply hardened. The weary distraction vanished, replaced by a glacial stillness that was far more terrifying than any outburst. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice lethally quiet. "I saw her," Clara pushed on, her pulse thundering in her ears. "This past Tuesday, at lunch, here, at table 9. She was with Adrian Thorne. They kissed, sir, and I overheard them talking about the Vanguard merger, about a signature. It sounded like they are planning something against you, against your company." Julian stared at her, his face an unreadable mask of granite. The silence stretched, becoming a physical pressure in the room. She saw a flicker in his eyes, but it wasn't shock or pain. It was the pure, cold fury of a monarch whose authority had been questioned by a peasant. "How dare you?" he whispered, the words like chips of ice. "Sir, I am telling you the truth. I just thought you should know." "You dare stand there," he interrupted, his voice a low, shaking hiss of contempt, "and spew this tabloid filth? You, a waitress? What is this, a shakedown? Are you hoping for a payoff to keep your pathetic little story quiet?" "No, Mr. Croft, I swear you thought wrong," he said, his face utterly devoid of emotion. "You are offensively, catastrophically out of your depth." At that exact moment, Isabella glided back to the table, a vision of serene beauty. "What's happening, darling? You look furious." Her eyes flicked to Clara, standing frozen and pale. "Oh, don't tell me. What did she do now? Forget the single ice sphere?" Julian never took his eyes off Clara. "This employee was just telling me a rather creative story. A work of fiction." Isabella's eyes narrowed. She looked from Julian's white-hot rage to Clara's terrified face. A flash of pure panic crossed her features before she concealed it behind a mask of theatrical outrage. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she scoffed, a brittle, ugly sound. "Let me guess. She saw me plotting with aliens? Or perhaps she thinks I'm leaving you for a penniless poet." She turned her venom on Clara. The jealousy of the lower classes is so predictable. They see a life they can never have, and their only impulse is to tear it down. She placed a proprietary hand on Julian's arm. "Darling, have her fired. Now, I don't want to look at her face for another second." Clara's world tilted. "Mr. Croft, please. The signature." Julian looked at Isabella, then back at Clara. His decision was swift and brutal, the cold calculation of a CEO cutting a liability. He raised a single finger, and the restaurant manager, Monsieur Dubois, materialized at his side. "Mr. Croft, is there a problem this evening?" "This employee," Julian said, gesturing vaguely in Clara's direction, "has made it her business to tell malicious, insulting lies about my fiancé. I want her gone." "But sir," Clara gasped. "Mr. Croft, I assure you, this is highly irregular," Dubois began, already sweating. "If she is still employed here tomorrow morning," Julian cut him off, his voice final and absolute, "I will not only pull my personal and corporate accounts, but I will make it my personal mission to ensure that every associate, client and competitor of Croft Global Logistics knows that Aurelia is an establishment that tolerates slander from its staff. I will ruin you." Dubois turned a sickly shade of grey. He looked at Clara with pure, unadulterated loathing. "Evans, my office. Now, you're fired. Monsieur Dubois, please, I was only trying to— Now, he barked. Tears of humiliation and terror sprang to Clara's eyes. She took one last look at Julian Croft. He was meticulously straightening his silverware, his expression utterly blank, as if she had already been erased from existence. Isabella was watching her, a small, cruel smile of triumph playing on her lips. Clara turned and walked away, the eyes of the entire dining room burning into her back. She had done the right thing. She had spoken the truth. And it had cost her everything. As she pushed through the kitchen doors, the last sound she heard was Isabella's light, victorious laughter. The next 2 months were a descent into a quiet, desperate hell. The manager's parting words, "You'll never work in this city again," had proven to be a prophecy. Every application to a fine dining establishment was met with a polite but firm rejection. The world of high-end service was small, and the word was out. Clara Evans was trouble. She was radioactive. She finally found a job working the graveyard shift at a gritty, 24-hour diner in an industrial corner of Queens. It was a cash-in-hand gig that paid a fraction of what she'd earned at Aurelia. The smell of stale grease clung to her clothes and hair. Her father's health was declining, and the medical bills were a mountain of paper she could no longer climb. She was drowning, and the man she had tried to save had been the one to push her head under the water. Meanwhile, Julian Croft tried to erase the incident. He told himself Clara was a disgruntled extortionist. He plunged himself into the Vanguard merger, the most complex deal of his career. But her words were a splinter in his mind. The signature. He started watching. He'd always trusted Adrian's judgment implicitly, delegating entire sections of the business to him. But now, he observed, he noticed Adrian's new, almost imperceptible arrogance. He saw the way Isabella would subtly defer to Adrian in conversations about the wedding plans she was supposedly orchestrating. "Adrian is handling the vendor contracts, darling. He has a much better head for the fine print than I do," she'd say, with a wave of her hand. The fine print. The splinter dug deeper. One night, fueled by a bottle of scotch and a gnawing unease, he did something he'd never done before. In his home office, he pulled up the executed digital copy of the Vanguard addendum, the one Adrian had signed on his behalf while he was in Singapore. He stared at the signature block. Julian Croft. He then pulled up a scan of his passport. He placed the two signatures side by side on his massive monitor. To the naked eye, they were identical. Perfect. But Clara's words echoed in his memory. His personal signature is so distinct. What had she seen that he couldn't? He zoomed in, magnifying the pixels until they were a jagged landscape of black and white. His own signature, the one from his passport, was fast, confident. The final stroke of the T was a sharp, decisive slash, the ink thinning at the end from the speed of the pen lifting from the paper. He remembered the art waitress, her strange, intense focus. He looked at the signature on the contract. The shape was perfect. The angle was perfect. But the final stroke of the T, it wasn't a slash. Under 400% magnification, he could see it. A tiny, almost invisible hesitation. The ink was slightly thicker at the end, a minute pooling where the pen had paused for a nanosecond too long. It was the mark of a forger, not a signer. The mark of someone drawing a shape, not writing a name. The blood drained from his face. It was a masterpiece of a forgery. But it was a forgery. His hands shaking, he unlocked the encrypted security logs for his company's servers. He was a logistics man. He tracked everything. He cross-referenced Adrian's and Isabella's corporate phone records. Hours of calls, logged as vendor coordination. He pulled their security keycard access logs, dozens of late nights in the office together, long after everyone else had gone home. The final piece fell into place when he accessed Adrian's encrypted personal cloud storage, a feat that took his best cybersecurity team 4 frantic hours to crack. And there it was. Not just love letters and illicit photos. There were drafts, dozens of scanned documents with Julian's signature, practiced over and over, and a file named Vanguard Final. It was the addendum, the one with the forged signature. The one that, upon the merger's completion, would transfer controlling interest of the newly formed entity's primary assets to a subsidiary holding company managed by the COO, by Adrian, the waitress, Clara. She hadn't just seen an affair. She had, with her artist's eye, seen the linchpin of the entire conspiracy. She had handed him the key, and he had thrown it, and her, away. A cold, terrifying calm descended upon Julian Croft. The fog of love and trust burned away, leaving behind the stark, ugly clarity of betrayal. He looked at the wedding invitation sitting on his desk. The party was in 2 days. 200 of New York's elite gathered at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. "You want a party, Isabella?" he whispered to the empty room. "You'll get a party you'll never forget." The great hall of the Met had been transformed into an ethereal forest of white orchids and shimmering fairy lights. The elite of New York society drifted through the space, champagne flutes in hand, their diamonds competing with the chandeliers. Isabella was a vision in a couture gown of blood-red silk, a necklace of flawless diamonds, a pre-wedding gift from Julian, blazing at her throat. Julian was the perfect host, smiling, shaking hands, while Adrian stood beside him, playing the role of the loyal best man to perfection. After the first course, Julian tapped a glass for silence. He stepped onto a small stage, a warm, brilliant smile on his face. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice echoing in the hushed hall. He looked directly at Isabella, who beamed back at him. "Tonight is about celebrating a union. It's about trust, loyalty, and the bonds that make us strong." He raised his glass. "To my fiancée Isabella." "To Isabella," the room chorused. "And of course," Julian continued, his smile never faltering as he turned to Adrian, "I must thank my best friend, my brother. Adrian, for your unwavering loyalty and your incredible attention to detail. I literally couldn't have done this without you." Adrian clapped him on the shoulder, a mask of humble friendship on his face. "And in the spirit of attention to detail," Julian said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "I've prepared a small presentation, a tribute to the truth in all its forms. Roll the clip." A massive screen descended behind him. Isabella looked momentarily confused, expecting a romantic photo montage. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy black and white security footage from Aurelia. The room gasped. It showed Isabella and Adrian at table 9. It showed them holding hands. And then, in agonizing high definition, it showed them kissing. Isabella's face turned the color of ash. The champagne glass slipped from her edge. The shattered champagne glass was a supernova on the marble floor, its sound a sharp, crystalline crack, swallowed by the sudden, cavernous silence of the great hall. Isabella's face, a moment before a mask of triumphant beauty, had crumbled into a mosaic of ash and disbelief. "Julian, what is this?" she stammered, the words flimsy, pathetic things in the face of the colossal, high-definition betrayal projected behind him. "I believe the term is evidence." Julian's voice was not loud, but the microphone carried its arctic chill to every corner of the room, freezing conversations and curdling smiles. The video feed, a grainy security camera angle from Aurelia, was now a split screen. On one side, the damning kiss. On the other, a scrolling cascade of their digital intimacy. Encrypted text messages, wire transfer receipts from offshore accounts, emails detailing their conspiracy. A digital tapestry woven from threads of pure deceit. "It's fake!" Isabella's shriek was a raw, desperate tear in the fabric of the silence. She took a staggering step towards the stage, a queen lurching from her toppled throne. "It's a deep fake! Adrian, for God's sake, tell him!" Adrian Thorne stood paralyzed, a statue of a man carved from fear. The charming smile he had worn all evening was gone, leaving behind the pale, slack-jawed face of a gambler who had just watched the house call his final, fatal bluff. "Oh, it's very real," Julian continued, his calm a terrifying counterpoint to their panic. "But the affair, you see, was the least interesting part of your betrayal. A pedestrian sin, really." The screen behind him shifted again, the sordid images of the affair replaced by something far more clinical, far more damning. 2 signatures, magnified 1,000 times, floated in stark black and white. One was labelled Authentic, J. Croft, Passport Archive. The other, from the Vanguard addendum, was labelled Forgery. A pulsating red circle highlighted the tiny, fatal hesitation at the end of the T, the microscopic pooling of ink that betrayed the forger's hand. "Your mistake, Adrian, wasn't sleeping with my fiancée. It was your hubris. It was thinking your meticulously practiced forgery was better than my data security. And it was underestimating the eye of an artist." He let the accusation hang in the air, a guillotine blade suspended over the crowd. He scanned the sea of faces, shock, horror, a flicker of schadenfreude in some, and his gaze settled on the empty space where his future was supposed to be. 2 months ago, a waitress at Aurelia, a young woman named Clara Evans, tried to warn me. She saw everything. She saw the affair, yes, but she also mentioned the signature, the detail, the one thing my own paranoia hadn't yet considered. I didn't listen. I was arrogant, insulated by a lifetime of believing my judgment was infallible. I had her fired. I destroyed her livelihood because I refused to believe that a person with nothing could possess more integrity than the 2 people who supposedly shared my life. He looked from Isabella's sobbing, heaving form to Adrian's frozen terror. "The engagement is, of course, terminated," he announced, the words as clean and final as a surgeon's incision. "Isabella, the fidelity and conspiracy clauses in our prenuptial agreement are now active. You will leave with nothing but the couture on your back. Security will escort you out." As 2 grim-faced men in dark suits moved towards her, her shrieks turned to guttural sobs. "And Adrian," Julian said, his voice dropping, pinning his former friend who was trying to melt into the aghast crowd. "Those men by the main entrance are not security. They are federal agents. They are here to arrest you for wire fraud, securities fraud, and a list of other felonies so long it will take you the rest of your life to read it. Your attention to detail, it seems, has created a very detailed case against you." As agents moved swiftly, cuffing a non-responsive Adrian, Julian looked out at the ruins of the evening. The orchids seemed to wilt. The diamonds seemed to dim. He had won. He had exposed the traitors, protected his empire, and executed his revenge with breathtaking precision. He felt nothing. Not triumph, not relief. Just a vast, hollow emptiness. "I owe my company," he said, his voice now quiet, almost weary, "and my life to the courage of a waitress I was too proud to believe. Enjoy the canapes." He stepped off the stage, leaving the smouldering wreckage of his public life behind him. He didn't look back. He walked through the stunned crowd, a ghost at his own party, and out into the cool, indifferent night, a man who had lost a meticulously crafted fantasy and had been violently reintroduced to the truth. The next 3 months were not a victory lap. They were an autopsy. Julian Croft, the man who saw the world as a chessboard, had been forced to admit he had been playing against himself. The days were a blur of depositions, board meetings, and brutal negotiations with federal prosecutors. He moved with the cold efficiency he was known for, surgically excising Adrian's network from his company, cauterizing the financial wounds, reinforcing the firewalls. He was a master of damage control. But the nights were different. In the sterile silence of his penthouse, overlooking a city that glittered like a field of shattered glass, the emptiness would descend. He would sit in the dark, a glass of untouched Macallan in his hand, and the memory of Clara Evans's face would surface. He didn't just remember her terror in the restaurant. He remembered her quiet dignity, the unwavering clarity in her eyes, the way her hands, though trembling, had remained steady as she cleared the plates. She had offered him the truth, a gift of immense value, and he had spat on it. He had punished her for her integrity. The thought was a shard of ice in his gut, one that wouldn't melt. His revenge against Isabella and Adrian had been a public spectacle, a display of power, but his crime against Clara had been quiet, personal, and far more revealing of the man he truly was. He had become the thing he despised most, a bully who used his power to crush someone defenseless. The shame was a physical weight, a pressure behind his sternum that made it difficult to breathe. He had his security team find her. It was more difficult than he'd anticipated. She had vanished. Her apartment in Queens was empty, her phone disconnected. She had been hounded by the press for a week after the story broke. The waitress who saved an empire, which had, he learned with a fresh wave of self-loathing, made her a pariah. No restaurant would touch her. She was a curiosity, a liability. He had not saved her. He had made her infamous, then abandoned her to the consequences. It took his team, with all their resources, nearly a month to locate her. She was working the graveyard shift at a grimy 24-hour diner in an industrial corner of Brooklyn, a place that smelled of stale grease and quiet desperation. A cash-in-hand job, anonymity, survival. He drove there himself at 3 a.m. in a nondescript sedan, not the chauffeured Bentley. The rain was lashing against the windshield, blurring the streetlights into watercolor smears. He walked in, the bell over the door jingling with a sound that felt both pathetic and profound. She was at the counter, her back to him, wiping it down with a slow, weary rhythm. She wore a cheap, mustard-yellow uniform that hung loosely on her frame. She looked thinner, the exhaustion etched into the slump of her shoulders. "Seat yourself," she said, her voice flat, tired, not turning around. "Coffee's what it is. I'll take a cup, black." The voice, his voice, cut through the diner's sleepy hum. He saw her entire body go rigid. She didn't move for a long, agonizing moment. Then she turned, slowly. The rag was still clutched in her hand. Her eyes met his. There was no surprise, no shock, just a deep, bone-weary recognition and a flicker of something that looked like fear. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the dullness in her hair. This was the reality of his actions. This was the cost of his pride. The sight of her broke something inside him that he hadn't known was still intact. She said nothing. She took a thick, chipped ceramic mug, slammed it onto the counter with a crack that echoed in the silence, and filled it from a pot of sludgy-looking coffee. The liquid sloshed over the side. She didn't wipe it up. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was devoid of all inflection. It was the voice of someone who had no energy left for anger. "Clara," he started, his own voice sounding rough, alien in his ears. I came to apologize." The word felt absurdly small, an insult, a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, dry and brittle like dead leaves, escaped her lips. An apology. She finally looked at him, truly looked at him, and he saw the full depth of her contempt. It was worse than hatred. It was a complete and utter dismissal. "You're a little late. Which part are you apologizing for? The part where you called me a liar and an extortionist in front of a room full of people? The part where you had me fired and blacklisted? Or the part where you used my name and my story as a punchline in your grand revenge fantasy, and then left me to be torn apart by reporters, which got me fired from the only other job I could find?" Each question was a precise, deliberate strike. He didn't flinch. He deserved every word. "All of it," he said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "Every part of it. There is no excuse for what I did. It was arrogant, cruel, and unforgivable." "So you agree," she said, turning away to wipe a clean spot on the counter. "It's unforgivable. Then what are you doing here? Do you think saying the word absolves you? You billionaires. You think everything is a transaction. You do a bad thing. You say a magic word, and the ledger is balanced. That's not how it works." "You're right," he said. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He hadn't come just with words. He knew words were worthless from him. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and slid it across the sticky counter. "This isn't an apology. It's restitution. It's an attempt to repair the damage I caused." She glanced at the envelope with disdain. "I don't want your money." "It's not for you to want or not want," he said, his voice firm but not harsh. "It's what I owe. It's a legal settlement for wrongful termination, defamation of character, and emotional distress drafted by a team of lawyers who specialize in this. It's ironclad. It's also the seed money for an independent foundation in your name that will provide legal counsel and financial aid to whistleblowers. Your name will be attached to something that helps people who do what you did. Inside, you'll find a cashier's check that will cover your father's medical care for the rest of his life, pay off your family's home, and fund any educational path you choose to pursue, anywhere in the world. It's not a gift. It is a debt. A fraction of the debt I owe you." She stared at the envelope, her jaw tight. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the pride warring with the crushing reality of her situation, the daughter warring with the victim. Slowly her hand reached out. Her fingers trembled as they touched the paper. She picked it up. It felt heavy in her hand. She didn't open it. She held it for a moment, then tucked it under the counter. "I'm taking it," she said, her voice a low whisper. "Not for me, for my father. Because his well-being matters more than my pride. And because you're right. You owe it." She finally looked up, and her eyes were clear, cold, and final. "And now the transaction is complete. So you can leave." "Clara." "No," she interrupted, her voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. "You don't get to fix the material things and think it gives you access to the rest. You can't put a price on the humiliation, on the fear, on looking at my father and knowing I couldn't provide for him because I did the right thing. You didn't just cost me my job, Mr. Croft. You cost me my faith in the idea that integrity has any value in a world run by men like you. The money fixes the first problem. It does nothing for the second. I want you to leave. I don't want to see you or hear from you ever again. Your presence is a reminder of what you did. I need to forget you to heal." He sat there, the truth of her words washing over him. She wasn't rejecting his money. She was rejecting him, and she was right too. He had been a destructive force in her life, a hurricane that had torn through her world, and now he was standing in the wreckage offering to pay for the lumber. He stood up slowly. He left $100 bill on the counter for the coffee he hadn't touched. It was a reflex, a stupid, meaningless gesture he instantly regretted. He walked to the door. With his hand on the handle, he looked back. She was standing exactly where he'd left her, her back ramrod straight, staring at the gleaming chrome of the coffee machine, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a final glance. The bell jingled, and he was gone, stepping back out into the rain. He hadn't been absolved. He had been dismissed. And for the first time in his life, Julian Croft understood that some debts could never be paid, only carried. 4 years later. Florence, Italy. The light in the studio was the color of honey, streaming through the tall, arched windows and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It smelled of turpentine, linseed oil, and old stone. Clara Evans worked on the final piece for her first solo exhibition, a massive canvas that dominated the far wall. She had left New York 2 months after that night in the diner. The money had been exactly what Julian had promised, a sum so significant it had felt like a fiction. It had secured her father's health, her family's future, and given her the one thing she craved more than anything: escape. She had enrolled at the Florence Academy of Art, disappearing into a world of masters and technique, of light and shadow. The first year had been about relearning to see. Her work was tight, technical, almost photographic. She painted still lifes with painstaking precision, trying to control every brush stroke, every reflection. She was hiding in the details. The breakthrough came during her second year, from a professor who looked at her technically flawless work and told her, "It is perfect and it is lifeless. You are painting what you see, Signorina. You are not painting the truth." The criticism cracked her open. She started to paint from memory. She painted the oppressive gold light of Aurelia. She painted the distorted reflection of a kiss in a gilt-edged mirror. She painted the exhaustion on her father's face, the fear in her own. Her canvases became darker, more complex. Her signature style began to emerge, hyper-realistic details dissolving into abstract fields of color and texture, exploring the chasm between surface and substance. The centerpiece of her exhibition was a triptych titled The Waitress, The King, The Forgery. The left panel was a portrait of a young woman in a yellow uniform, her face obscured, her hands chapped, red but steady, holding a silver tray. The right panel was a man in a flawless suit, but his face was a chaotic vortex of stock tickers and data streams, a crown of binary code floating above his head. The central, largest panel was an immense, photorealistic close-up of a single, flawed signature. The final stroke of the T was a deliberate, ugly smear of thickened impasto, a wound on the canvas. The piece was about power, perception, and the violent truth of a single, overlooked detail. The exhibition opened on a warm Tuscan evening. The gallery was crowded, the air buzzing with Italian and English. Clara, dressed in a simple black dress, felt a sense of surreal detachment. People were looking at her pain, her humiliation, and calling it art. They were praising her eye, her courage. A week later, the gallery owner approached her, his face alight with excitement. The triptych had sold. A private collector, an American, had purchased it through a European agent for an astronomical sum. He had insisted on anonymity. Clara felt a strange, cold prickle of unease. 2 days later, a courier delivered a long, flat box to her studio. There was no return address. Inside, nestled in velvet, was not a letter, but a single, antique paintbrush. The handle was worn smooth with use, the bristles still stained with the faint, spectral blue of a forgotten sky. Tucked alongside it was a small, embossed card. It read, "I see it now. Not just the detail, but the artist, the truth. Thank you, JC." He hadn't forgotten. He hadn't moved on. He had been watching. The knowledge was not comforting. It was unsettling. He had bought her pain, possessed the most intimate expression of her trauma. He had completed another transaction. She didn't reply. She put the brush in a drawer and tried to forget. But she couldn't. The gesture was different. He hadn't sent money or lawyers. He had sent a tool, an acknowledgement, a message in a language she understood. 6 months passed. Her exhibition travelled to London. She went with it. One afternoon, she was walking through the Tate Modern, and she saw him. He was standing alone in front of a Rothko, utterly still. He wasn't the man from the diner, haunted and ashamed. He wasn't the king from the restaurant, cold and imperious. He was just a man in a well-fitting grey sweater and dark trousers, looking at a painting. He looked older. The arrogance had been weathered out of him, replaced by a quiet, contemplative stillness. She could have turned and walked away. A part of her screamed to do just that. But the woman who had walked up to table 12 all those years ago was still inside her. She was no longer afraid. She walked up and stood beside him. They looked at the vast canvas, at the shimmering rectangles of maroon and black that seemed to vibrate with a deep, sorrowful energy. "They say he wanted his paintings to feel like a punch to the gut," she said quietly, not looking at him. "The sublime and the tragic, all at once." He turned his head slowly. His stormy grey eyes met hers. There was no shock, only a deep, weary recognition, as if he had been waiting for this moment for 4 years. "Hello, Clara," he said. His voice was different, quieter. "Julian," she acknowledged. They stood in silence for another minute. "I didn't know if you'd be here," he said. "I just hoped." "Why did you buy the painting?" she asked, the question direct, stripped of all artifice. "Because I needed to," he answered, his gaze returning to the Rothko. "For years I looked at the forgery on my screen as evidence, as data, a clue that saved my company. But when I saw your work, I finally understood. It wasn't a clue. It was a wound, a violation. You painted what it felt like. You painted the truth of it, not the fact of it. I bought it to remember that difference. It hangs in my office, where I used to have a wall of monitors. It's the only thing on the wall." She processed this. It was not the answer she expected. "The brush?" she asked. "It belonged to John Singer Sargent," he said. "I thought it felt right. A tool for an artist, a piece of history, a way of saying thank you without using words, which I have proven to be spectacularly bad at." They started to walk, their footsteps echoing softly in the gallery. They didn't talk about the past, not the restaurant, not the diner. They talked about art. He spoke about it with a surprising, self-deprecating intelligence. He had, he explained, spent the last 4 years educating himself. He had divested from 2/3 of his company, restructuring the rest into a B Corp, pouring billions into a foundation that focused on ethics in technology and corporate governance. He had stepped down as CEO. He spent his time reading, learning, listening. He was trying to learn how to see. She told him about Florence, about her process, about the struggle to find her own voice. She spoke not as a victim, but as a creator, an equal. When they reached the exit, they paused under the grey London sky. The unspoken history between them was a palpable thing, a third presence. "I am not the man I was, Clara," he said, his eyes searching hers. I know that doesn't change what I did, but I have spent every day since then trying to become someone who would not have done it. Someone who would have listened. Someone who would have seen you. I am not the woman I was either, she replied, her voice steady. She wouldn't have survived. I had to paint my way out of that memory, out of that restaurant. He nodded, a flicker of pain in his eyes. I know. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I have no right to it. I am not asking for a second chance. I burned the first one to the ground. I am just asking if we might have a first. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't make a grand promise. He just stood there, open, vulnerable, his entire carefully constructed world dismantled and rebuilt on a foundation she had inadvertently provided. Clara looked at him, the king in his self-imposed exile. She thought of the girl in the mustard-yellow uniform and the artist she had become. The journey had been brutal, but it had been hers. She had saved herself, and in doing so, she had shown him how to do the same. This wasn't a fairy tale. There was no prince, no damsel. There were just two survivors of a storm, standing in the quiet aftermath, wondering if it was possible to build something new from the wreckage. I'm having coffee tomorrow, she said, a small, tentative smile touching her lips for the first time. Near the Borough Market, at 10. A slow, profound relief washed over his face, a light returning to his stormy eyes. I'll be there, he said. She turned and walked away, melting into the London crowd. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a promise. It was just coffee. It was a blank canvas. And for the first time in a very long time, it felt like a beginning.